Thank you, Pastor Doreen. Today I'd like to read a scripture from Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 following. Matthew chapter 4, verse 18. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee and the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. Title of this short teaching is called Mending the Nets. Mending the Nets. And so we see in this passage, Jesus calling people to follow him and to become co-workers with him. And we see that he calls fishermen. And I think it's interesting that he calls two sets of fishermen doing two sets of things that fishermen do. So the first set, Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, they're casting a net into the lake. So he finds these fishermen casting a net. In other words, they were actively fishing. Their net was being cast into the water in order to bring in a catch of fish. And Jesus saw what they were doing and said, "Hey, I'll send you out to fish for people if you follow me." So he was saying, what you're doing out there, I want you to do, only not to catch fish, but to catch people. And immediately, Peter and Andrew left their nets to follow him to catch people and become fishers of men. But then going on from there, he sees another two brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother. They were in a boat with their father. And what were they doing? They weren't casting their nets. They were mending their nets. Some translations put preparing their nets, not quite true. They were mending their nets. You ever seen on TV these old fishermen? And when they're not casting their nets, they're mending their nets. Even in modern programs like, trawler, and you see them going out trawling. Basically, when they're not casting their nets mechanically, when they come in, they have to check their nets. They have to mend their nets to make sure that there's no holes in. And so in these two callings, I think we have two things that are very important, because Jesus is paralleling the fishing career with following him. And there is a casting and there is a mending, casting and a mending. And so when we look at following Jesus, we are fishers of men too, even if you've never had experience fishing. I've never cast a net, but I have cast a rod many times in North Yorkshire in the River Ouse. As a young boy, I was part of a fishing club. And so I know what it is to cast a line and to prepare a line and line tangles and all those things, but never quite cast a net. Maybe some of you have been involved in casting nets. And your fishing is only as good as your net is mended. Because obviously, if the net has holes in it or tangles, it won't spread properly like it's meant to. It'll get caught up in itself. Or if it does catch fish, then what will happen is the pressure on the net as the fish are caught in the net. Where it's weakest in the net, that's the biggest danger. So if there is a hole in the net and it's not mended, then the fish will just by pressure go through that hole and be lost. And so that's what James and John were doing. They were in their boat mending their nets. No point casting the nets until they've mended those nets. And the word for mend the nets is a Greek word that means to mend, to repair, to make suitable, to make whole, to equip, and to make something fit for use. In fact, the same word is used in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1 or 2, speaking about restoring somebody who had fallen. The word there is to mend them, to repair them, to equip them, to make them fit for use. It's the same word for restoring somebody who's fallen as for mending a net. And so when we look at this, we see not only the fish that needs to be caught, but we also the nets that need to be mended. And I believe that we are the nets. We are the nets that catch the fish. Who else catches the fish? We are in this illustration when the church, or when Peter and his brother Andrew, when they cast the net to catch people, what are they doing? They're evangelizing. Just after we read about the calling of the fishermen that were casting the net that left, and the fishermen that were mending the net that left, we then, in verse 23 of Matthew 4, start seeing the casting and the fishing. Jesus is teaching, proclaiming the good news, healing every disease. News was spreading. People were made whole and healed and mended, and large crowds from Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across Jordan followed him. In other words, they were catching shoals and shoals of human beings by casting the net of the gospel with signs following. And so when we see this casting the net and fixing the net, we can look at this in various levels. We can say to ourselves, how good is the church in London or Britain in casting the net and mending the nets? How good is our local church in both casting the net and mending the net? And how about you as a fisherman? Because not only do we work on teams in boats and things like that as fishermen, but the really old-fashioned fishermen would also, wouldn't they, just with a personal net. Sometimes you see them on the Nile in Egypt, and they sort of wade out, one person with a personal net, and sort of throws it in order to catch it. So the casting of the net can be done at very different levels, and therefore the mending of the net can be done at very different levels. Casting of the net, evangelizing, but the mending of the net, I think this is talking about mending our lives in discipleship and causing us to become more like Jesus. In other words, when you cast your net in witnessing or evangelizing, what are you actually casting? Well, you're sort of casting your character, aren't you? You're casting your character, you're casting your Christian character and fruit of the Holy Spirit. So we often talk about the fact that, you know, non-Christians want to be witnessed to by authentic Christians, and that they're looking for the authentic church. And when we're talking about an authentic Christian, we're talking about someone who I'm saying has had their nets mended, mended, because you are casting your character when you are reaching out, no matter what you do, whether it's a large-scale crusade that Christians are coming together for, or a local evangelistic initiative by a local church, or just personally reaching out to your neighbor. At all those levels, you're not just preaching the gospel, you're casting character, because people are going to come into contact with those that are involved in the evangelistic initiative. In other words, the nets for the fishers of men that follow Jesus, the nets are our lives. And so we when we're mending people's lives in the church, when we're growing people through life groups and ministry and prayer and challenging one another and asking the Lord to heal us, in one way, I know it's more complex and deeper than just this, but this is my message tonight. Our nets are being mended so that we can be more effective in casting the net of the gospel in all the ways and forms that we cast good news of Jesus, in word and character and deed. If we are casting nets and those nets of our lives are not being mended or constantly attended to, then what's going to happen is our evangelism will be ineffective. Either we won't catch any fish at all, or the fish that we catch may not stay in the net and be landed, and consolidated into the church. So what we need is mending and casting. Mending and casting. If I was to ask you and reflect on it myself personally, how are you at casting your net? You might be good at casting your net, the net of the gospel, the net out to give people opportunities to follow Jesus. You might be a good net caster. If I was to ask you, how are you at mending your nets? Do you have that self-awareness? Are you open to input from the word, the spirit, and your brothers and sisters in Christ and your leaders? Are you open enough for them to notice the holes in your nets? Or perhaps maybe it's not a hole in the net, but perhaps our nets have got caught or snagged in something. We recently, didn't we, did a series on offense, and offense is a snag, a snare. And if we bring the phrase offense into the sort of mix our metaphors, it's a snare, but how would you snare a net? Well, it would get caught, wouldn't it, on something deep, and there's nothing worse, or not much worse for a fisherman, except a big hole in the net, is for that net to get snagged on a rock or something, and then the boat can't move and the net is snagged and the fishing stops. And as long as that net is snagged, nothing effective takes place. And when it's finally maybe broken from the snag, then there's a lot of ripped and damaged netting that needs to be repaired. It's a terrible thing to have your net snagged. As I've said, I've never fished with a net, but I fished with rod and line, and there's many times I've had my line snagged on the weeds or on something, thinking it was a fish sometimes, and then realizing that no, I've snagged it. Many a time I've lost one of my favorite floats or some decent hooks and lead weight because my line was snagged, and then spend ages trying to unsnag it. And finally it snaps and I have to start all over again, wasting precious time in trying to catch the fish that I'm after. I think you can see maybe the parallels I'm trying to make about our lives, that we can get the nets of our lives that are to be cast out, we can get them snagged. We can get them snagged personally through offense or other things that prevent us from, casting our net as a fisher of people, things that hold us back, distract us, snag us in life. Well, these can be many, many, many things. We find that we aren't really casting our net at all in any way, or we're being hampered. And so if you were to look at your life, your personal life, and say, how am I casting my net? Is it snagged? Has it got holes in? Do you need mended and restored to be a net that is effective? And we could also look at that as a local church. Is the local church snagged? Are the local church people snagged when it comes to casting the net? Are we too, I'm not speaking about Emmanuel, I'm speaking in general, are we too focused on ourselves? Are we not, do we have the right balance of of discipling and casting the net. And so, sometimes we have to look at our lives and say, wait a second, I'm not casting the net, my net is broken. I need healing, I need help, I need restoration. I got some holes, some things have happened. I need more discipleship. I need to grow a little bit more to become effective. Even just some of the teaching on apologetics that we made available to people, both online and also those that are able to come. That's partly to help mend nets in our understanding of God's word, so that we can be more effective fishermen and casters of nets. So there's those nets. Are we casting the net? Are we casting the net? And is that net? But then there's the mending of the net. Is our net snagged? Or are our nets worn out? Or our nets worn out? Sometimes the nets of our lives can be worn out. And I'm not talking about somebody over evangelizing. We often find that most evangelizing people seem to get renewed with vigor because they get such joy out of evangelizing. But sometimes what can happen is our nets wear out, they're worn out. Maybe they haven't been used much or kept well, and so we find that we're worn out and we need renewal. And so just like we need revival, or maybe that's the wrong word, just like we need an awakening, or we need people to get saved, we also need renewal. So the church needs to be renewed, and the church also needs to be set on fire in casting the nets, doesn't it? We need both. So, we can't give up on healing, on inner healing, biblical inner healing, on discipleship, on character, on character formation, on becoming more like Jesus, on dealing with attitudes and issues and heart issues. All these are renewing and mending to make our nets more effective. And then when they're more effective, we can then, cast them better. Sometimes, of course, in your nets, you end up catching debris, rubbish. Like I said, I haven't cast nets, but sometimes when I have cast my rod into the River Ouse and thought I had a fish, and then out comes, something like an old boot or a whole bunch of, wood or something that's some rubbish that's been there at the bottom. And so my line is reeling in debris. But with casting the nets, sometimes your nets can be filled with rubbish and mess instead of fish. And if your nets are filled with rubbish, how can they be filled with fish? So sometimes we have to get the debris out of our nets, so that get the junk out of our nets so that they're clean, and cut away the rubbish and mend those so they're ready for casting. So it's a very simple message I'm speaking today, nothing profound, but I hope that the image is profound, that at every level of church, the question is, how are our nets? Are we mending the nets of people's lives? Because it's people's lives that Jesus casts, fishers of men. Jesus casts our character, our lives into the ocean of humanity to make fisher of men. So how are our nets? Are we renewing our nets? And are we repairing our nets like those fishermen were? And then having repaired, are we also actively casting our nets in various forms and ways? And are there lots of nets in word and deed that are being cast, good nets, good quality nets, being cast into the neighborhood and the workplace and the schools, or wherever God allows us, casting those nets, good, solid, quality, mended nets, and nets that are not just mended, but are kept in a good state of repair. It's not just waiting till they break down, but checking our nets, looking at our nets, soul care, making sure that we're dealing with things, aware of what's happening, going for help for one another. It's an ongoing thing, keeping those nets clean, but also then casting those nets again. What's the point in being a Christian that has the most beautiful nets that are never cast. What's the point in casting a net that's full of holes, snagged, or got debris in it? It's both and. And if we just followed this picture, we would do very well in going forward. Thank you, Pastor Doreen.